The day my dad found a new job and came home with a bag of cookies still warm, with the smell of butter, I felt this strange emptiness inside. Weird, right? I should have been happy. We all should have cheered and hugged each other just like in those feel-good movies. But at that moment when Dad said, "We're going to be okay now, Jack," I just nodded quietly, turned away and pretended to look for something in the kitchen. I did not understand why. Not until much later. I think maybe it was because those hardest days were also the times we felt the closest. When you have nothing, that is when you truly see who you still have. I grew up in a winter like that. We could not afford new clothes, but Mom would sit by a flickering candle patching up our old jackets. There were no Christmas presents, but my older brother saved the last slice of apple and hid it for me. And on those nights when the whole family sat around an old crackling radio listening to the weather forecast, somehow it all felt strangely peaceful. It was the late 1960s. The small town where I grew up seemed to be wrapped in a gray coat, corner stores on Main Street. But later than usual, factory whistles blew less and less, and the now hiring signs flapped back and forth in the winter wind with a sharp, hollow sound. My father, Henry, had just been laid off from the quarry after more than 15 years of shift work. He came home wearing clothes covered in white dust, cradling his toolbox like it was a part of him, and when he set it down on the kitchen floor, it made a short, heavy clack. My mother, Maggie, from that day on would sit close to her foot-pedaled sewing machine every night, one hand guiding the fabric, the other pulling the thread, her feet moving steadily, like she was keeping time for the whole house, making sure it did not drift away. Our kitchen was tiny. The soft, yellow light from the oil lamp poured down onto the wooden table, which was warped with age and patched at the cracked edge with an old wedge. The wood stove stood against the wall, streaked with soot, and every time we opened its little door, the wind would whistle through the bricks. The smell of sautéed onions, black pepper, and cooked potatoes would mix with the scent of burning wood, and somewhere in that blend, there was always the faint old book smell coming from the little shelf by the door where Mom kept her debt notebooks and recipe clippings from the newspaper. That smell to this day comes back to me anytime I walk into a kitchen with a pot boiling on the stove. Dinner back then did not come with much choice. Mom would usually make a big pot of potato soup sometimes, adding in a few slices of carrot or a little celery picked from the backyard. The enamel pot was chipped and missing a handle, but every time it sat on the wood stove and the steam rose up, it felt like a promise. Dad sat at the head of the table, his hands calloused from years of quarry work, but always gentle when holding his soup bowl. Tom, my brother, liked to pretend he was a waiter, ladling out soup for everyone with a dented aluminum scoop. Little Billy sat with his legs swinging and asked whether we had any bread today. We ate slowly, trying to stretch out the feeling of being full, and we laughed about the small things, the neighbor's cat sneaking into the house again, Mr. Cooper's wild stories at school, or how the table kept wobbling like it was dancing to a tune only it could hear. One night the soup suddenly boiled over. It spilled onto the stove with a sharp hiss, white foam bubbling up, and the smell of potatoes filled the kitchen. I froze, scared we would have less to eat, and Billy backed away, grabbing Mom's sleeve. But she did not panic. She turned off the flame, lifted the pot with a cloth, calmly wiped the stove, and looked at us with a smile I will never forget. I I still remember the night the soup boiled over. Mom didn't panic. She just said, "There's less water, but the love is still full." That simple sentence, as soft as a breath, somehow made the kitchen feel bigger, and we felt like we had eaten more than enough. Dad said nothing. He pulled out his wrinkled handkerchief and quickly wiped his eyes like soot had flown in. When he bent down to light the stove again, his hands were shaking just a little. He never said sorry because a spilled pot of soup was nobody's fault. But the way he held the matchbox, turning each match slowly in his fingers, gave me the feeling that he was trying his best to keep the whole family from spilling over too. That night, Mom stayed up sewing. The sound of the machine ticking along was like the heartbeat of our house. I sat beside her as her little assistant, cutting thread, sorting buttons sometimes, reading aloud bits of newspaper that had been used to line the floor beneath the sewing machine. One tiny article talked about how to save gas in the winter. Mom nodded as she listened, then said, "Tomorrow remember to gather dry branches from behind the house. The maple trees have been shedding a lot." Looking back now, I think those simple instructions were what kept me grounded. Every little task, every small movement, stitched together into a whole day that made sense. The next morning, a soft line of sunlight rested on the windowsill. I took a deep breath and smelled the sunshine baked into our laundry, the kind of clean scent that no modern dryer can ever replicate. Mom served breakfast, a few slices of old bread, toasted again with the last bit of peanut butter scraped from the bottom of the jar. Tom pretended to be a radio host, reading out the Wilson family restaurant menu, then bowed like a waiter riding a wooden horse. Dad chuckled and Billy clapped like he was watching a circus show. We were poor, but that poor man's breakfast was packed with things money could never buy: the sound of laughter, the clink of dishes, the soft tapping of chopsticks on the side of a pot like a drum beat, keeping our little team in step. Speaking of bread, I suddenly remember Mom's old bicycle basket tied to the back seat. Every now and then, she would stop by the bakery at the end of the street to ask for leftover breadcrumbs for the chickens, and she would save a handful for us to dip into the soup to make it thicker. At first, I felt embarrassed whenever classmates saw us, but every time I saw Mom smiling and chatting about the weather with the bakery lady, I understood. We were not begging. We were connecting. And this little town looked after one another the way people pull the blanket up for someone else when the wind sneaks in. That evening after dinner, Dad opened up his toolbox. He took out a small light bulb, a few screws, a roll of copper wire, and laid them all on the table like little soldiers. "Tomorrow I'll try to see if the furnace still has some life in it," he said. I looked at those rough hands and in the grease and quarry dust. I could still see space for patience. I didn't know yet that just a few days later, the ductwork in the basement would completely give out and we'd be stepping into one of the strangest winters of our lives. Every night before bed, Mom would walk through the house, gently touching each of our shoulders. "All right, just that one word." I would nod and think about the next day, gathering dry branches, running over to borrow a cookie mold from the neighbor, helping Dad tighten some loose connections. Sometimes I felt too tired and wanted to argue with Tom, but all it took was the sound of the sewing machine stopping and Mom's voice, "You two enough." Her tone was soft, like placing a spoon on the table, but it pulled the whole family back into the same rhythm. I still remember how the kitchen firelight reflected off Mom's cheeks, light and shadow, flowing across her face like water over stones. I remember the rich smell of soup, just the right amount of salt, a little too much pepper to fight off the early cold. And I remember the feeling of being full, not just full in the stomach, but full in the heart, knowing that no matter how fierce the wind outside got inside this home, we were sitting close together. If anyone asked me what I still carry from that old kitchen, I would say this. It's the instinct that kicks in when a pot boils over. Do not panic, turn the heat down, wipe the stove, and serve each other what's left. That was how we lived back then. And funny enough, that turns out to be the best way to hold on to the people you love. That winter was one of the coldest on record. People downtown joked that the wind rolling off the lake had forgotten its way out and got stuck howling on our rooftops. One morning, the furnace in the basement gave one last groan and went completely silent, just like the radio had that night long ago. Dad lay flat on the floor head, inside the dark crawlspace flashlight, wedged between his teeth tools, clinking against metal. When he slid back out dust on his forehead and frustration in his eyes, I could see he was holding in the truth. The repairman came, looked around for a while, then gave us a number. It sounded like a cruel joke to a wallet already empty. So we moved all our blankets into the living room. Dad pulled the couch close to the wood stove. Mom laid down a thick wool rug to keep our backs from getting too cold, and we closed off the other rooms, leaving just one narrow space, our version of a family tent where the oil lamp became our campfire. Ice clung to the window frames like tiny teeth, and every time we exhaled, our breath floated in front of us like little clouds. The wind lashed the porch roof like someone dragging a giant sheet across the sky. The first night my brothers and I fought over the thickest blanket, the old floral one frayed at the edges, the one Mom said was sent by our grandmother. I grabbed one corner, Tom grabbed the other, like two little soldiers guarding their turf. "Enough, Dad," said not loudly. He handed us a thinner blanket instead, looked us in the eyes, then placed it gently over Mom's legs. We went quiet. Cold has a way of teaching silence better than scolding ever could. On the second night, when everyone thought I was asleep, I felt the thick blanket being pulled slightly toward me. I opened my eyes to see just enough of it covering my shoulders. I turned and saw Tom, pretending to shift in his sleep. I didn't say thank you, and he didn't say it's for you. We were learning to let some things be said in silence. During the day, Mom would toast bread right on the wood stove, spreading a bit of butter or sprinkling cinnamon sugar for warmth and smell. We all stood close to the stove, our backs warming up, while our faces stayed cold. Dad taught me how to split wood along the grain, how to stack the logs so the fire would burn evenly, and how to slide a small stick underneath to help the smoke travel cleanly. These little tricks made me feel a bit older, like I had been promoted to the household fire crew. In the afternoons, the windows stayed shut tight, and the light fell in thin slices on the wall. Each slice of sunlight like a Polaroid snapshot. Billy wrapped in blankets with just his eyes showing Mom rolling thread in her palm, and Dad sitting beside her, rubbing his fingers together like counting something that had no number. Outside, snow fell so softly that even the maple trees stopped looking like trees. I remember pressing my hand against the glass, feeling the cold shoot straight through to the bone. And yet in all that cold, we leaned into each other like fallen leaves gathering in the same groove. We huddled like baby birds, and strangely, I'd never felt so warm inside. That line isn't something I made up to tell a nice story. It is exactly what I felt during those nights under thin blankets. Some nights I could hear my own heartbeat, and then the heartbeat of the house, the soft crackle of the wood stove, the wind whistling through the chimney, and the wall clock ticking slower than usual, as if it too was curling up for warmth. One evening the power went out because of a snowstorm. Mom lit more candles, and their glow wrapped around the picture frames on the shelf, making the faces inside them look like they had just come alive. Dad began to tell stories, not ghost stories like he usually joked about, but one from when he first started working at the quarry. Back then, wages were barely worth counting. One night he fell asleep in the locker room, and when he woke up, someone had laid an extra jacket over him. It was cold, he said, but that night I did not feel cold. I glanced at Tom. He gave a small nod, like he had just understood a lesson that needed no words. There is a strange kind of sadness that enters with the cold. It softens people. Tom and I suddenly learned to take turns sitting closer to the stove, learned to pour each other a half cup of cocoa so the others would seem fuller. Billy still spun his knit cap around like nothing had changed, but I could see him trying to sit closer to Mom. She still smiled, not loudly, just enough to make her eyes fold into two narrow lines of light. Dad used to say, "There is not much TV in this house, but there sure is a lot of talking." Back then, we still had a black and white television, the kind where the picture looked like snowfall in a box. And yet, sitting close together watching that fuzzy screen, I saw everything clearly. Another night, Tom and I got into a small scuffle, maybe because I kicked him in my sleep. We both sat up, ready to glare at each other like two cats on a fence. Before I could say anything, Mom just pulled the blanket higher, covering both of us like she was laying down a peace treaty. "Sleep," she said. "Some lessons do not need to be explained." Sometimes all it takes is a blanket. Early in the morning, we took turns wiping the condensation from the inside of the windows, where the steam had gathered into droplets and slid down like indoor rain. Dad said it was to prevent mold. I did it because I liked watching the dry streaks form along my cloth like drawing new roads. Cups of water were set near the stove to keep the air humid. The heat fogged up their rims, and Billy used his finger to draw silly shapes, dogs, trees, a bicycle he dreamed of riding one day. I do not know how long he would carry that dream, only that every time he finished drawing, the fog would return, and he would draw again, patient as a grown-up. One night, the wind howled so fiercely that smoke started blowing back into the room through the wood stove. Dad jumped up, opened the door just a crack to let the air flow. The cold rushed in like a wild animal, slipping into shoes, crawling up sleeves. Mom wrapped the blankets tighter around us and silently placed her hand on Dad's back. Just a single touch. He turned around and nodded. That night we barely slept, but strangely in the morning we all felt lighter. I think maybe it was because when the worst of the cold finally rushed in, we really saw how much we had each other. That winter passed slowly, like counting dried beans, one day at a time. A few weeks later, when the furnace was finally repaired, the warm air whooshed through the vents like a long sigh that had been held in too long. But that first night, even with the heat back, we still slept together in the living room. No one wanted to go back to separate rooms. Some habits are woven from scarcity, and when comfort returns, you hesitate to cut the thread. Now at 68 years old, I can still close my eyes and see that living room just as clearly as if I were stepping into it again. The flickering candles casting soft golden halos on the walls, the worn but trusted blankets draped across our laps, the wind outside rattling the windows like a gentle reminder of the cold we were safe from, and the steady breathing of everyone settled in for the night. And even now, decades later, I still believe, just as deeply as I did back then, that warmth is never just about temperature. It is not something that can be measured in degrees or controlled by a thermostat. Warmth, to me, is something far more human. It is the quiet moment when someone half asleep instinctively pulls the blanket a little closer, then without needing to speak, shifts part of it toward you so you will not be cold. It is in the small gestures, unspoken, unnoticed by many, that carry the heaviest meaning. Warmth is when the whole family leans in just a little bit closer to each other on a windy night, like a nest of baby birds clinging to one another for safety, for comfort. And the oldest among them, be it a parent, a grandparent, or just the one who has learned to listen better than to speak, knows how to say we're all right, not with words, but with a single steady hand on someone's back, or a gentle nudge of the knee under the table. It is that kind of warmth, quiet, shared, unspoken, that stays with you, long after the heat has faded, long after the blankets are folded, and the candles burn down to wax stubs. That kind of warmth is what I carry with me still. One evening, the storytelling program began with the sound of rain falling through the microphone. The announcer said rain was beating against the studio's windows. I looked outside. There was no rain. I thought of some place in the city where it really was raining on glass while we sat inside our dry house, listening to distant rain. Strangely, that sound made the room feel warmer. Mom put a small pot of water on the stove so the steam would spread. Billy drew a cloud and an umbrella on the window pane. Dad tapped lightly on the tabletop, in time with the background music. I leaned back, feeling my heart fill up like a cup just poured, not for any grand reason, but because a sound had found just the right spot to land. Later, the radio would act up again. This time I took it apart before asking Dad. I dusted it, tightened a screw, turned a few knobs. When the music came back, I realized something had changed. Not the radio, but me. I understood that among the things I could not control, there were small things I could care for: a loose joint, a patch of dust, a habit of sitting together at the right hour. Those nights saved us not by the stories on the air, but by the way we listened together. If you ask me now which object from that old house I would keep for the rest of my life, I would say that radio, though, worn though the broadcasts have changed, though the storytelling programs are not what they used to be, I want to preserve that crackling opening sound, the way people's voices crawl through static to reach us, the way Mom dusted the radio nightly, the way Dad tightened one more screw, and the way we ordinary people gathered around a small light to push back a large darkness. That winter, Billy had exactly one coat made by Mom, from scrap fabrics neighbors sent. The body was patched in uneven squares, moss green, earth brown, ash gray. The elbows had old velvet from a pair of dress pants. The buttons were mismatched, one round as a coin, another flat like a seed. In the morning, I helped him pull up the zipper. Its teeth clicked like Mom's scissors cutting fabric the night before. The residual scent of sun from laundry lines clung to the coat, the same clean smell no dryer today could replicate. At schoolyard, the mischievous kids teased, "Look, a blanket you can walk in." Billy's ears turned red, but he smiled, voice thin, as if telling a secret. Mom said this is a superhero coat. He clasped the flaps together, stretched his arms as though ready to fly, and ran a loop around the field. I felt both pride and anger. I wanted to scold the others, but feared making Billy more embarrassed. I chose to walk by him, matching his slow pace, my way of saying I'm here. At lunch, a classmate fumbled one of Billy's odd buttons, accidentally pulling a thread loose. The button rolled to his feet. Billy bent, picked it up, handed it to me, saying, "You keep it, I'll have Mom sew it later today." Then he took from his bag a small bun, split it in half, and passed the larger half to the child who had caused the mishap, making the other awkward and bashful. Some gestures are softer than any explanation, like half a bun. In the afternoon, I saw the homeroom teacher lightly touch Billy's shoulder, saying, "That's a beautiful coat, unique." When school ended, the bus driver joked "super suit" and made a cape flying gesture. Billy glowed with pride, walking as though he had his own soundtrack. On the bus, he pulled from his pocket a smooth, round pebble, saying he found it beneath a maple tree that day. "Put it in a pocket, it'll make the coat fly faster." I laughed, and suddenly, the coat was no longer a sign of poverty. It was a map of small joys that made my brother happy. That night, Mom lifted the coat onto the table, turned it inside out, like opening an embroidery canvas. She threaded her needle, carefully sewing back and forth, occasionally dipping the tip in dry soap to smooth the pull. I watched faint pencil marks she had drawn, places where she reinforced the stitching, where Billy often played. Her hands moved slowly, but sure as though sewing together pieces of memory. Mom used to stitch each patch like mending our childhood, each one sewn with love. That night, snow drifted softly. Billy laid his head on his arm and fell asleep early. I sat gazing at the coat draped over the chair, imagining tomorrow someone would touch it, another seam would need fixing. It occurred to me that maybe we all have a patched coat, not necessarily literal, but something that wraps us in vulnerable times, a kind word, a routine, a song. For Billy, the coat was real, and Mom was the one stitching. The next morning, Billy insisted on tying his own wool scarf. He fumbled until it became a big crooked knot, comical yet proud. "Superhero self-tie," he said. I straightened it, but he waved my hand away. "It's better crooked, so it's fast." I left it. In this one, fast perhaps meant being yourself. One day the class held a sports meet. The wind sliced at faces, but Billy insisted on running the relay. I worried he'd be cold, but he said, "This coat is warm." Mom sewed in a bread layer latch. I laughed at how he called the padding bread layer. During the run, the patches of green and brown flipped and shifted like a mosaic, a little bird trying to fly. He didn't win, but he helped someone who stumbled behind him to get up. The crowd cheered, and I saw the boy in a patched coat become a little taller without a single new pair of shoes. By the season's end, only a few fabric patches held strong. Mom placed her hand on the coat and sighed. She asked Billy, "Change a button?" Billy shook his head. "Leave them, Mom." So I remember the happiest days. He pointed to the mismatched buttons and named them. The round one is the day I was praised for reading aloud. The square one is when snow fell thick. The chipped one is the day I fell and didn't cry. I learned how to mark time with objects, not a journal, just the garment in your hands. One morning, Dad came home earlier than usual. His jacket, dusted with cement in his eyes, was a glint I had not seen in a long time. He said, "They need workers at the new construction site in the southern part of town. I start next week." Just 3 words, but like opening a window. At dinner, he placed a neat stack of forms on the table, said the pay wasn't much, but enough to take the family out for a meal. We chose a simple burger place at the corner, of flickering red and blue neon sign windows, tinted with sunset reflection. The red leather booths were worn at the edges. The counter had a jukebox, playing slow songs. The waitress called us Han and Sweetie as though we were old friends. I felt my stomach rumble softly. Billy stared at the menu, mouth making an O. We sat by the window. Dad studied the menu as though reading a blueprint, then smiled and folded it. 1 burger each is enough. Mom nodded, her eyes bright, but her hands still calculating. We didn't order sides or dessert, just water with lemon ice clinking softly. When the burgers arrived, the smell of grilled meat met warm buns in a wave of aroma. Melted cheese dripped down the sides like afternoon sun pouring in. Dad raised his glass and gently tapped the rim against Mom's. We didn't dare order extras, but everybody's smiling like we just escaped a gray dream. The waitress returned with a big tray of fries. On the house, she said, "Congratulations on the new job." I looked at Dad. How did she know? He shrugged, pursed his lips. "Probably a cook," whispered. Mom folded her hands as though praying, then opened napkins and portioned fries for everyone like sharing sunshine on the table. In the sizzle of the kitchen, I heard the beat of a new kind of peace. Billy took delicate bites of his burger, being careful. It wouldn't fall apart. He called it the way rich people eat. Tom joked, but his voice shook with happiness. I glanced around at a man at the next table, wiping his hands with a blue towel, a young couple sharing a milkshake behind us. Under the yellow lights, everyone seemed to have passed through some turning point. After we finished, Dad picked up the check, inspected, the number nodded. "Just right," he said. Getting up, I saw him straighten his back, just like the way he used to snap a steel beam into place. On the way home, the night wind smelled of freshly cut grass. Billy took a few steps back, facing arms out, like a bird testing wind. Mom said tomorrow she'd make a special dinner at home. No extra spending, just add more laughter. From that day, Dad woke earlier, made strong coffee, put it in a flask. He brought lunch boxes and came home with the scent of fresh wood paint, sometimes rain. I learned to see small joys in those smells, each one proof that the one you love was building something steady, not just for the construction site, but for home. In 1971, we had just enough money to keep the lights on, to fill our bellies with something warm, and to get through each day without asking for help, but not quite enough to afford what most would call a real Christmas tree. We knew it as the kind that stood tall in storefront windows, full and fragrant, wrapped in tinsel and glowing lights. One chilly afternoon, as the days crept toward Christmas, Tom looked up from his schoolwork and said, almost casually, "What if we made our own tree this year?" There was no hesitation. Billy and I nodded immediately, as if the idea had been waiting in the air for someone to say it out loud. We bundled up, pulled on our worn gloves, and set off through the neighborhood park. The ground was soft, with damp earth and scattered with fallen pine branches. We wandered slowly, examining each one like it was a piece of treasure. Some were too brittle, some uneven, but here and there we found the good ones green, fresh enough with needles that still held their shape. We picked the ones with a nice spread ones that felt balanced and stacked them carefully in our arms like rare findings from an expedition. Back home, Dad was already waiting in the garage. He handed us an old broomstick with a cracked handle and a few pieces of wire salvaged from his toolbox. "This right here," he said, holding up the broomstick, "is going to be your tree trunk." There was no trace of sarcasm in his voice, only pride and something like encouragement wrapped in simplicity. We cut the broomstick down to size drilled holes through its sides and began sliding the branches in one by one. We turned and adjusted them, stepping back often to make sure they looked like a real tree. We weren't just building something out of scraps, we were giving shape to a holiday. My hands soon glistened with pine sap, sticky and sweet smelling. Sawdust collected under my fingernails, and green needles clung to my sleeves. But none of it mattered, because as I looked at the little tree taking form, something stirred in my chest. It was not just pride, it was joy. A kind of quiet, glowing joy that made me stand up straighter, as if I had just finished constructing something far greater than a homemade Christmas tree. In my mind, I had completed a project that meant more than any perfect pine bought from a lot. I had helped build something that belonged to us, that told a story of making do with love, creativity, and the hands we had. Mom laid out scrap fabric on the table. She cut long strips, stitched them into bows, each a deep, warm shade: cocoa, brown, burgundy, olive. She steeped cinnamon sticks in water so the room smelled of spice. Billy strung popcorn into a garland with a thick needle. He called it the tree's necklace. Tom bent wire hangers into hooks for paper ornaments I cut from cereal boxes. The table was speckled with bits of paper light, falling over them like gold flecks. We found an old string light box in the attic. When Dad plugged it in, the string hummed, but no bulb lit. He said, "One bad bulb, and the whole string stays dark." He gave me spare bulbs and taught me how to replace them one by one, test them. I crawled along the strand like caring for a small patient. On the seventh bulb, the string burst into light. We all gasped in unison, as though hearing an orchestra hit exactly the right chord. The lights shone over the fabric bows, making every patch sparkle again. The Christmas gifts were handmade. I cut a photo frame from cardboard, wrapped it with leftover paper from the roll's end. Inside, I sketched Mom's smiling face awkwardly, but her eyes still smiled. Tom made Dad a tool pouch from old canvas, sewing 2 perfect seams. Mom even nodded in approval. Billy gave me a free afternoon ticket, a slip of paper that read, "One afternoon fishing trip. No one fights for the spot." We tucked the gifts under the tree, each piece unwrapped, but pretending not to see. On Christmas Eve, neighbors stopped by. Some brought apple pie, others brought a bottle of syrup. Mom served them hot cocoa. They stood around the handmade tree, admiring it. "It's beautiful." I saw Billy beaming like he owned an entire forest. From the pocket of his superhero coat, he pulled out a tiny pine cone, placed it on the highest branch, and said, "This is my star." I looked at it and thought, if anyone out there ever needed a recipe for a warm night, we could write it like this: 1 broken broomstick, plus a few fallen branches, plus scraps of fabric, an old string of lights. People standing close together. After everyone left, the house grew quiet again. I sat beneath the tree, looking up at the fabric bows swaying gently in the draft from the door. Above me, the lights crackled softly, like snow falling somewhere far away. Mom sat down and opened the photo frame I'd made. She covered her mouth as she smiled, eyes shimmering. Dad opened the tool pouch and said, "It fits perfectly," as if that were the happiest thing a craftsman could say. Tom slid Billy's little day out ticket into his wallet and patted his chest, keeping it near my heart to stay warm. I looked around at all of them and I finally understood why even years later, even when we could afford the biggest tree in the store, I still wanted to hang up that old cloth bow again. None of us got what we wished for, but we had everything we needed. That Christmas we came to understand something deeper, something that no store, no catalog, and no sparkling display could ever teach us. Not everything magical has to come wrapped in shiny paper or sit beneath a perfectly trimmed tree. Some kinds of magic are quiet. They pass gently from hand to hand through thread pulled carefully by fingers that have known work and love, through the rhythm of a needle, stitching together more than just fabric, stitching together people, memories, seasons. They show up in soft breaths and simple words. Let me help you, I'll hold that for you. Mom will tie it back for you. Phrases so ordinary, they might be overlooked yet powerful enough to hold a family together through the hardest winters. And when the lights finally went out, what stayed behind wasn't the tree we had built from broken branches or the handmade gifts sitting quietly in the corner. It wasn't anything you could unwrap. What remained, what glowed in the silence, was the shared feeling that we had built something real together, something held up by kindness, patched with care, and made warm not by electricity but by intention. We stood around it shoulder to shoulder, believing with all our hearts that even in the coldest of seasons, there is always a place that can feel like home. There is always a small circle of light that reminds you you are not alone, and this right here is enough. Back then we had an old apple tree in the backyard, its trunk rough like the back of a gentle beast. When the season came ripe, apples fell with soft thuds into the grass, the sweetness mixing with the scent of earth. That afternoon, Tom insisted on climbing up to fill the tin bucket for baking pies later that night. He grabbed a low branch and with one push was up in the fork. I stood below holding the bucket, part excited, part nervous. The branches were brittle in places. Wind rustled the leaves overhead like a warning. Tom reached out, stretching his arm toward a bright red cluster of apples that hung just beyond his grasp. I saw the branch sway under his weight and felt a flicker of fear rise in my chest. I shouted, "Don't!" But it was already too late. The branch gave way with a sharp, splintering crack, a sound so clean and sudden that even now, all these years later, I can still hear it in perfect detail. It was not just wood that broke. It felt like something inside me snapped too, like an invisible cord pulled too tight had finally given out. Tom dropped fast and hard, landing with a thud on the grass below. For a second, everything held still. Then he rolled over, curling inward, clutching his arm with both hands, his elbow bent in a way that no elbow should, angled and twisted like a broken hinge. His face drained of color, pale as paper, and his lips pressed together in a line so tight I could barely see them. A single tear slid down his cheek, not from crying, but from pain, too sharp for sound. I dropped the metal bucket apples, spilling out across the grass in all directions, and ran to him, my feet barely touching the ground. I remember calling his name over and over as if repetition could somehow turn back time or stop the pain. But all I could do was kneel beside him and try to keep both of us from falling apart. Dad heard the noise and came running from the porch. He did not ask questions, did not scold. He quickly wrapped Tom's arm in a towel, cushioned it with his folded coat, and scooped him up like a child. Mom rushed behind, holding the door and whispering prayers. The car sped off gravel, crunching under the tires. I sat in the back hands, gripping the front seat knees, shaking with every bump in the road. In the emergency room, the smell of antiseptic was as cold as water. Tom's eyes stayed shut, his teeth clenched occasionally, letting out a quiet groan. Dad sat beside him, hand on his forehead, eyes locked on the doctor, like hanging onto a lifeline. When the doctor said they had to reset the bone and apply a cast, Tom nodded, but Dad swallowed hard like he had just drunk a glass full of sand. I stood at the door, listening to metal tools clinking to Tom's sharp breaths, to Mom softly, humming an old lullaby. Finally, the doctor said it would be okay. Tom wore a big white cast like he was carrying a chunk of cloud. As everyone exhaled in relief, I noticed Dad bowing his head very low. His hand, the one that had always felt like iron pliers, was trembling. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, but the tears still fell, leaving a shining streak across the calluses. I never thought my father could cry, until I saw his rough hand shaking out of love for his child. In that moment, the image of a tough man in my head suddenly cracked open, and somehow that crack made him feel more human than ever. On the drive home, Tom held his cast like a shield. Mom told everyone to speak softly. The evening wind came in through the crack in the window, brushing against the fresh smell of hospital. Dad slowed at the bend in the road. I saw him glance in the rearview mirror to check that Tom was still breathing steadily. When we got home, he walked straight out to the apple tree and stood there a long time. I thought he would cut the broken branch right away, but instead, he picked up the scattered apples, placing them into the bucket one by one, counting softly, like he was counting what was still intact. In the days that followed, Tom lived with the big white cast. His classmates signed it in every color, drawing smiley faces. He learned to write with his other hand, slowly but steadily. I made him cardboard shields from cereal boxes. Dad built a little wall hook so Tom could rest his arm while he slept. Mom sewed a padded strap to wear around his neck so the cast would not pull sideways. The whole family adjusted to that cast like sinking to a new heartbeat. One evening, Tom fell asleep early. Dad sat on the porch, peeling an apple with a small knife. The skin fell in a perfect spiral onto the wooden floor. I sat beside him silent. He suddenly said, "When I was your age, your uncle fell from a tree too." Grandma cried all night. Back then, I didn't understand why grown-ups cried. Today I do. He split the apple into 4, handed me a piece. It was sweet, but there was a faint saltiness in the flavor, like someone had accidentally carried the taste of hospital tears into the kitchen. On the day Tom got his cast removed, the whole family stood outside. His arm was still weak, but his eyes were bright. I looked back at the apple tree, where the broken branch had been a small green bud had appeared. I thought maybe pain sprouts in its own way, quietly, without drama, but strong enough to make us hold each other closer. One time, Mom asked me to write a few words on the back of a photo. I asked what I should write. She said, "Write the date and one sentence you want to keep." I thought for a while, then wrote, "This month. We are close enough to all fit in one frame." Mom smiled, took a blue pen, and traced over the date to make it clearer. She gently stroked the photo's surface, like soothing a child to sleep. After that picture, the hard years continued. But every time we had a new photo, Mom would place it right next to the first one. She said, "Let the years lean on each other, so they don't grow weary." On gray days, she would lay the album open on the windowsill, letting the Rare sunlight touched the pages. The light made the faces in the pictures seem to shift slightly. A soft warmth spread through the kitchen, like the feeling when you open the oven and hear the heat sigh out. Over the years, the house filled with better-looking photos, graduations, weddings, birthdays. The frames were glossy, the compositions tidy, but every time I needed to remember who I really was, I returned to that old photo. In it, my parents were no longer young. We were no longer small. We were just exactly ourselves, standing close, not because anyone told us to, but because standing apart would have felt cold. When Mom grew old and her hands started to tremble, I was afraid she might tear the picture. But she was someone who had spent her whole life caring for fragile things. She never broke anything with her hands, only time could do that. One afternoon she said, "Take this to get scanned just to be safe." I nodded, but before I did, I took a picture of it on my phone, capturing the photo resting in her palm with the faint green veins under her skin, like a little map leading back home. And if you ask why we only had one single picture from those hard years, I would say being poor did not mean lacking photographs. It meant that every photo carried the weight of many years. Every time I open the album, that photo pulls me back to the wooden fence, to the thin sunshine and soft breeze, to a woman saying, "Take it so you'll remember," and to the quiet understanding that standing close is the only way to fit into the frame of life. That night, the wind stood still. On the back porch, the shadow of the birch tree stretched across the wooden steps, long and thin, like strands of thread. Mom sat in her wicker chair, a light shawl over her shoulders. I poured her tea, the gentle kind, with dried apple she liked, and sat beside her. The clock in the house ticked softly, slowly, like someone walking with no hurry. I was 68, with white in my hair. She was over 90, her hands thin, but still warm. Some questions take a lifetime to ask. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice soft, so I wouldn't break the quiet beauty of the night. Back then, when things were that hard, how did you still feel joy? Mom looked at me, not answering right away. She set her cup down on the saucer, the clink of porcelain like a single musical note. The kitchen light behind us reflected in her eyes, deep and still like a lake in early autumn. "Joy," she repeated, like tasting an old word. Then she turned toward the yard, where the neighbor's porch light spilled over the fence. "'Cause I saw you kids together every day. That was enough." Her words were light like a leaf falling, but it landed on water that had been waiting. I sat still, listening to the crickets blending into the grass, to the warm scent rising from the wooden porch, to the even rhythm of my mother's breathing. In my mind, all the years of friction and misalignment began to click into place. It wasn't that Mom had forgotten weariness. It wasn't that she held back tears. She had simply chosen a different way to measure a day. She slowly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small tin box. She opened the lid. Inside was a handful of colorful buttons catching the light with a soft glimmer. Buttons fall off. Over the years, she said, I keep them so when something breaks, I'll know how to fix it. She placed one round button in my palm. See, scratched, chipped? But when sewn into the right spot, the coat is still a coat. I looked at the button in my hand, small, ordinary, yet it felt as heavy as a piece of life. Were you ever afraid? I asked. Of course, she answered quickly, then smiled. But every night when I opened the kitchen door and saw you were home, not out in the rain, not lost in anger, I felt at peace. That was joy. I thought of the noisy nights in our old house, clinking dishes, wine slapping the door, someone telling a story that never really ended. Turns out joy doesn't need to be loud just enough to make someone want to stay. Mom placed her hand on my wrist, a gesture so familiar I felt like a boy again, just a little taller each summer. When you asked that, she said, "It means you're starting to count." I nodded, throat dry. She looked toward the family photo on the shelf, now chipped at the edges. Even on the hardest days, she whispered, I could point to something beautiful, a meal with all 4 chairs, filled a quiet apology, or a coat with every button fastened. She turned back to me. And later, when things are easier, do not let those beautiful things fall through busy hands. A breeze stirred. A dry leaf slid across the porch. Mom bent down, picked it up, turned it in the light like examining an old stamp. "Tomorrow I'll press this leaf between 2 pages of a book," she said, "so when you open it, you'll remember today." "Had wind?" I laughed. She had never stopped teaching me how to keep little things. That was how she made time softer, easier to hold. I held on to her answer like a string in the dark, and I felt myself pulled out of the worries of now the uncertainties of retirement, the silence in a too quiet house, the noise of phones, the feeling that everything might be too much. That night I learned a new way to count, not with money or belongings or square footage, but by the number of people who will sit with you beside a small light. I realized the thing we call wealth is not in your wallet. It's in how many people are willing to sit beside you when things get hard. That realization didn't shout, didn't sparkle. It came like warmth through a well-worn blanket. It made me feel lighter, like I just unbuttoned something that had been stuck for too long. I walked Mom back inside, turned off the porch light. The hallway dimmed gently. As I pulled the blanket up to her chest, I heard her mumble an old bedtime wish. In the kitchen, I paused by the cabinet where the old photo stood, slightly tilted. I straightened it, and I knew when morning came, things would still be exactly as they should. A simple breakfast, a call to my brother, a hug longer than usual for my wife, a text to check in on my 2 sons. Some forms of wealth are just that enough to hold the day steady. This morning, my house was quiet in a tidy way. The fridge was full, the calendar on the door packed with reminders, the dishwasher still warm. On the table, each person had placed their phone face down, but the screens still pulsed under the wood, like little fish beneath the surface. The house is much bigger than it used to be. The bedrooms give everyone space, and yet sometimes abundance gives off an empty echo you can only hear if you're truly still. Linda set out the pastries, just a hint of butter lingering in the crust. My 2 sons came by for the weekend each, with their own busy story. They started to talk, then got up for a call. I didn't blame them. Life has its rhythm. But sometimes, looking at the empty chair growing cold again, I felt like in this house, the wind now blew a different way, not through the door, but through the people. I opened the drawer and took out the old photo. It had yellowed. The edges were soft, like a book read too many times. I placed it in the middle of the dining table next to the plate of pastries. Underneath, I slid a white napkin so it would not slip. The late light fell across the picture, wiping away some of the dust. Everyone leaned in instinctively, as if trying to read a small line of text. Linda smiled, touched the corner of the photo. "That day," she said, and did not finish, but I heard the rest in the silence. "Look here," I said to the boys, placing the photo gently in the center of the table like it was something fragile. "This is the only photo we have from those days." They paused, then sat down their phones. Finally, quiet faces softening, maybe sensing this wasn't just a story, but a doorway. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry." I continued, my voice steady but low. "I'm telling you because I want you to remember something important. Sometimes people have something truly good in their lives, something they don't even realize is rare. And over time, they forget they have it. Or worse, they let it slip away while chasing something they think matters more." They both nodded quietly, thoughtfully, the kind of nod that doesn't need words to follow. It was like two small pebbles knocking gently together inside a coat pocket, a small sound, but one you remember. Linda, who'd been listening from the kitchen, stepped forward with the coffee pot and filled our cups. The rich, dark aroma drifted through the room like warmth made visible. It filled the corners, softened. The air made everything feel a little slower, a little more deliberate, like time was giving us a moment to catch up. For a few minutes, nobody spoke. We just sat there with the photo between us and the quiet humming of a house that has seen many seasons. And in that silence, I could feel something shift. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady. A sense that maybe the story of a single photo could still reach across years, reminding us that the most valuable things are often the ones sitting right beside us. The kitchen now has white lights, smooth countertops, everything in order, but the breeze outside still carries that same dry sun scent from when it touches wood. I opened the window, letting the sun in, listening to birds mixed with the sound of distant cars. For a moment, the house felt like it used to, not because of what was missing, but because everyone had truly sat down. One small act, but it opened the door to so many others. I asked each person to share one good thing from today, our old game. Linda talked about the flowers blooming on the porch. The eldest said he helped an old man with groceries. The youngest said he had called an old friend. When it came to me, I said, "Today we all looked in the same direction." They laughed and Linda touched my shoulder. A simple touch, and the story found its place. That afternoon, everyone returned to their own schedules. I stayed in the living room alone, the old armchair. In its usual spot, a second cup of coffee, still warm. I listened to the neighbor mowing grass children, laughing on the sidewalk, wind brushing against the curtains. These days, abundance is something you can touch paint, not yet peeling, no leak in the roof, plenty of drawers in the kitchen. But abundance can also build a thin wall between people, a wall made of calendars, notifications, headphones. I closed my eyes and pictured a different kind of door, the one that leads to the wooden table where people rest their hands on top of each other, simple and close. I stood up and placed the old photo in the center of the table, not to store it away, but to leave it where it can be seen. It sat there like a compass. Every time I feel myself drifting into small distractions, it pulls me back north. I looked at the faces in the photo, not perfect, but close. "We were poor back then," I whispered, "but none of us were lonely." That sentence felt like a sticky note left on the fridge door, reminding me to check if this home still has enough people, not just enough things. At night, I tried a new habit, left my phone outside the dining room, set 4 empty glasses on the table, even if it was just the two of us today. Linda played an old song, the acoustic guitar notes clinking like 2 soft spoons. We ate slowly, talked about small things, a neighbor changing seeds, a new cashier at the store, the tree out back, leaning toward the sunlight. When we finished, I did not turn on the TV. I closed the window, left half the lights off, just enough for two people to sit and keep talking a little longer. Late at night, the city quieted into a low hum. I opened the drawer and pulled out a single candle. I placed it beside the photo and lit it. The little flame didn't chase away the dark. It invited it closer to warm us. Linda and I leaned into each other. We didn't tell ghost stories, didn't need cocoa. We just sat in silence watching the flame. In its light, I could see the only wealth that never fades: a seat next to someone you love. Tomorrow the house will still be big, the food still plenty, everyone with their own room and phone. But I know I can choose to place something in the center of the table to gather our gaze again. Choose to ask one honest question. Choose one evening with fewer lights so we can see each other more clearly. I do not want to glorify poverty. I just want to keep what it gave us: closeness without needing a reason. In the end, I wrote a small note and slipped it behind the photo just for me to read. First thing every morning. Don't forget to pull your chair a little closer. And now, if you've made it this far, I'd like to borrow the window frame of this story to ask you something. If you've ever lived through days like those, do you still remember what it truly felt like to be close to someone? Share it in the comments, because somewhere out there, someone might be waiting for a story just like yours to find their way back home.